my lords, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great privilege indeed to welcome you here this evening to the Academy's New Year reception and lecture. And you've all arrived here despite the weather, which has caused at least a shortage of 25 to 30 people that had registered to be with us. So there'll be all the more to eat downstairs. But I am delighted to welcome fellows and their guests, particularly our friends from the BBC, and we understand that the new Director General, the Director General designate, Lord Hall, is on his way. So we're very honoured that he should be with us, which just shows you the high esteem in which our tonight's lecture is held. Now, particularly as he told me he hasn't met him yet. So, on behalf of the Academy's Council, I would very much like to thank you all for your continued support of the Academy. And in particular, I should like to thank all those who have contributed to the funding of the refurbishment of this building. And a number of you will have seen the refurbished building for the first time, and I trust you like our new home. And we're very proud of it, and we think it's worthy of the engineering profession. We have a very busy year ahead as we anticipate the announcement of the first winner of our new Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering in March. And I'm delighted that the chairman of the judges, our former past president, Lord Brewers, is present and still surviving the ordeal of that. This is a magnificent £1 million biannual prize known as the Queen Elizabeth Prize in Engineering, and that will be published in March. And the presentation of the award will be made by Her Majesty in June. So I'm certain that will help put engineering on the map where we want it to be. In March also, we look forward to hosting the first Grand Global Challenge Summit here in London, which is a joint project between our colleagues in the American and Chinese Academies of Engineering. Now, this New Year reception is an opportunity for fellows, partners and special guests to meet socially and at the same time to hear an expert speak on a subject of broad interest with an engineering theme. So I'd like to say a few words about John Linwood, our guest speaker this evening, whom I met for the first time, I guess it was less than a year ago. And I was so fascinated by John's story of what goes on behind the scenes at the BBC in terms of engineering, I hasten to say, yeah, you're quite alive this evening, I can see. I was absolutely fascinated by his work and his leadership, and I suggested to him then, I think he thought I was joking, that he's got to come to the Royal Academy and give a lecture to us. So he's here tonight, and we give you a great welcome, John. Thank you. Now, the BBC made its first radio broadcast just over 90 years ago, and has been at the forefront of broadcasting technology ever since. And John's lecture will bring us right up to date with the latest developments. Now, he is the Chief Technology Officer for the BBC, managing technology, distribution, archive division, which sits within the operations group. He took up his role in April 2009 and is responsible for delivering the BBC's technology strategy, a role which encompasses the delivery and management of the broadcast and enterprise technology infrastructure behind all BBC output, and of course also overseeing, as you would expect, the corporation's IT requirements. John joined the BBC from Yahoo, where he was Senior Vice President of International Engineering, overseeing a staff of 1,600 located across 22 countries, who delivered all the company's services outside of the United States. This included the development of some of Yahoo's most successful consumer products, including social networking, social media, and user-generated content. He has a lot to answer for. Now, prior to Yahoo, John spent 11 years at Microsoft, managing MSN's international engineering, and before that held senior roles in several organizations, including the Dodge Group, Omega Software, and Mega Limited. He started his career in his native Zimbabwe as a software developer and systems analyst. And it now gives me very great pleasure to invite John to give his lecture, after which he has agreed to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir John. Well, I guess seeing the title of the speech, Behind the Scenes at the BBC, one of the things that I had to do was quickly rewrite my speech when I found that the Director General was coming tonight. So unfortunately, I can't share any of the scandal with you that I was going to share. But what I'd like to do tonight, if I may, is take you on 3 journeys. The first journey is my personal journey, and Sir John alluded to some of my background, but very briefly tell you a little bit about my background and how I ended up standing here tonight. And I have to say, I'm as surprised as you are that I'm standing here tonight. The second journey is to look at the technology within the BBC and that journey that the BBC has gone from those original radio broadcasts in 1922 through to the sort of amazing multimedia output that we have today that goes out across the world and is consumed by tens of millions of people every day. And finally, I'd like to talk about the incredible journey that the audio and the video and the interactive content goes through from creation within the BBC and then out to our audiences and how they consume that. So, as Sir John said, I actually grew up in Africa, in the middle of Africa in Zimbabwe, and actually technology wasn't high on my agenda at all. I spent most of my childhood determined to be a vet. I'd read the James Herriot books, and that was the life for me. And because I was a maths student, I did it. They came around and said, we're doing these things called computer aptitude tests. And I don't know if anyone in the audience ever did one, but this was, back in the 70s, and they gave you this sort of logic test. And I did this logic test, did very well, and they said, you should be in computers. And so I did a complete abrupt change of direction and decided that I was going into technology instead of into computing, sort of set the direction for the rest of my life. So I started out working in technology and as a software developer. And the interesting thing was I worked on both mainframes, so big, IBM machines and NCR machines, but also something that we used to call super minis. So things called digital made a super mini called a VAX. Now, by today's standards, they weren't mini at all. These things were the size of a very large deep freeze, but they were interactive and they were very exciting. They were they were the iPads of the day, if you like, and so it was very exciting for me to work on those. And I want to tell you a story about one of my earliest memories of the impact of technology on people's lives. So the very first system I worked on as a computer programmer was a payroll system, but it was a payroll system for the Zimbabwe Army. And we had just done a major upgrade to it, and there was a huge hardware failure about 2 days before the payroll was due to run. And so all the payroll failed to run, and none of the output went out, and so they didn't know how much to pay the soldiers when payday came around. And I remember being at home, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang, and I answered the phone, and there was a very agitated brigadier on the other end of the line, and he said, there's a large crowd of armed men standing outside of my office demanding to be paid. And he said to me, would you come down and explain to them that it's a computer problem and it's not my fault? Needless to say, I declined his offer and didn't make the journey down there. But I think what I loved about the technology and loved about computers in particular was, when they worked, they had this wonderful ability to change people's lives and do great things. And so I went on through my career really looking for jobs and opportunities that gave me the opportunity to, produce content or produce output that was seen by large numbers of people, but secondly, work on things that really had an impact or a benefit to the audiences or to the consumers of the technology. And so I did 3 startup companies in my younger days when I was very young and naive and didn't really understand the risk of doing such things, and then joined Microsoft and Yahoo, as Sir John said. And after 20 years with American companies, I was approached by the BBC and asked whether I would join and look after technology for the BBC. And it was a huge honor. I mean, the BBC is a global brand, and of course I was overwhelmed by the opportunity to do that. But I was very, very nervous. I was coming from a West Coast technology company to the BBC, which was this venerable institution, which was, in my view, going to be incredibly, formal and staid and quite potentially stuffy. And so my wife said, "You'll last about a week," she said. And actually, I've been there 3.5 years. So I've lasted longer than a week. But the interesting thing is that the BBC from the outside is very different to the BBC on the inside. So from the outside, as I say, it's an amazing brand, but people do look at it as this sort of large, probably sometimes overinflated institution that's probably not very fast-moving and not very technologically advanced. And yet in reality what you find is that technology is at the core of everything the BBC does. And it's full of very smart, passionate, driven people. And so I've actually loved working at the BBC and find it an incredibly stimulating environment. So that's my journey. But what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about the BBC's technology journey. So John mentioned that the BBC was founded in 1922. Lord Reith headed up the BBC, and it started during radio broadcasts soon after it was launched. But engineering was the root of the BBC. So right in the centre of the BBC, engineering was there. And the BBC used to design and manufacture much of its own equipment. And hopefully some of you will have had a chance to look outside. I brought along some various trinkets from our archive in terms of technology within the BBC that not only that we've developed, but was used by the BBC in the early days. And one of the things that many people don't realise is that when the BBC first started radio broadcasts, people didn't have radio sets. So the BBC not only had to build the transmitters and the microphones and the studios, but it also had to build the radio sets that people used to receive those early broadcasts. And the role that I hold today, Chief Technology Officer, back then was called Chief Engineer. And I always had this impression of the Chief Engineer of the BBC, probably a chap with a very large moustache. They all were chaps in those days, so they were all men in the early days of the BBC. But he probably had a very large moustache. He was an engineer, so he definitely smoked a pipe. And I just had this view of this very sort of distinguished gentleman who was, number 2 in the company, second only to the Director General, had a very large oak-panelled office. I've seen his office. It still exists. It's now a meeting room. So I thought I'd do a little bit of research and find out who was that first chief engineer in the BBC. So it turns out that he didn't have a moustache, and I couldn't find any reference to him smoking a pipe. So I'd got some of the things wrong, but he did have a large oak-panelled office. His name was Captain Peter Pendleton Eckersley, and he was appointed as the chief engineer in 1922. Interesting enough, though, Captain Pendleton Eckersley divorced his wife a few years later, and that was too much of a scandal for the BBC, so he was asked to leave the BBC because he was getting divorced. And he went on to join MI6, so I don't know if I've got a future career, perhaps as James Bond or something like that, but I'm looking forward to it if that's the case. So the BBC, really led the world in terms of radio broadcast, and then along came television. And as early as 1936, the BBC launched a television service. And in fact, we have a 1937 Emitron camera outside here for you to have a look at. In the early days, it was a 405 line, so quite a grainy picture by today's standards. But the television sets themselves were so small that it actually probably didn't show up. And then, the BBC continued to lead in a number of areas of technology, both inventing that technology ourselves or leading by partnering with other organizations in terms of the development of the technology. So things like 625-line television, colour TV, obviously. And the interesting thing for me in all of these was that the BBC was taking the audience forward and telling the audience what they should do next. So, you know, when television came out, it was the BBC that told you to get a television. When colour came out, it was the BBC that told you to get colour. And I'll touch on that later on in my talk, because the world has changed for the BBC. The advent of new technology and online and interactive has really changed the relationship between the BBC and our audiences. But other things we did, you know, we were one of the first television companies to provide captioning on the broadcast that we did. CFAX, obviously, quite a fantastic thing. NICAM digital stereo, who in the room remembers NICAM digital stereo? We invented that within the BBC and then licensed that around the world. Telecine, to convert film to television, we were one of the leaders with that one. And then, of course, we've changed a number of the things under the covers within the BBC. So, you know, the ways in which we produce and deliver content has changed dramatically over the years, and the BBC has led the way. And I'll touch on some of those. And then more recently, not only in terms of online like iPlayer and interactive content, but also digital broadcast. So, you know, we've seen digital terrestrial, our digital switchover that completed late last year, and digital audio broadcast on radio. The BBC's been a key player in the development of that and the deployment of that. But not everything we did was successful. So it seems incredible today, but up until the 1950s, there was no way to record video. So everything was done live. All of the output on the television was done live, and it wasn't recorded. And so the BBC developed a piece of equipment which they call VERA, Vision Electronic Recording Apparatus. And you know I mentioned those super mini computers earlier on? Well, this was much larger than one of those super mini computers. It was a huge cabinet that had massive magnetic tape reels on it. Now, the problem is that video requires quite a lot of capacity on tape. And so they worked out that the tape would have to travel at 70 feet per second past the heads on this device in order to capture all of the signal. And so what they did is that they had these massive, great reels of tape spinning at incredible speed, and this tape flying past the heads at 70 feet per second. And nobody was allowed in the room, because when the tape snapped, it would decapitate you if you were within 10 feet of the device. Luckily, an American company called Ampex came up with a clever idea, and they said, well, what about if we spun the heads on a spindle, and then we didn't have to have the tape going quite so fast, so less people got decapitated after that. And so the BBC moved over onto these Ampex devices and started recording its output on that, and could do recorded programs. The interesting thing, though, is in the 1960s, one Ampex tape recorder cost £30,000. And the average house price at the time was less than £3,000. So these were incredibly expensive devices by today's standards. The other challenge was that tape cost around £120 per hour. And so the BBC did a terrible, terrible thing. It started reusing the tapes. It started overwriting old programs because it was too expensive to buy tape to keep everything. And so even today we have an amnesty program where if any of you have got old TV programs in your loft that come from the sort of 60s and 70s, bring them into us, we'll digitize them, we'll give you back digital copies of that, and we'll put the originals into the archive for future generations. Because unfortunately we've lost a piece of our history because of this technology challenge that we have. Another technology decision that the BBC made, which was kind of rather strange and interesting, was that, you know, a control panel has sliders on it, or faders they're called. So in the early days of radio, the BBC decided that the fader had to go, as you pushed it away from you, that was turning the sound down, and pulling it towards you was turning the sound up. And the legend has it that if you fell asleep at the desk, you would slump forward and you would slide the faders away, and then people would know that you'd fallen asleep and somebody would go and do something about it. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's a lovely story. The challenge was, though, that the rest of the world had it the other way around, so everyone else had the fader going down when you pulled it towards you. And so what would happen is new engineers joining the BBC or freelance engineers coming in to work at the BBC would push the fader the wrong way, and so suddenly you would deafen the audience, or just as the music started playing, we'd turn the music on. So eventually we had to give up on our non-standard approach and standardize our technology around the rest of the world. But I think, you know, what this tells you is that the BBC has always been an innovator, has always tried to develop technology and enhance technology for the greater good of the audience, but also for the wider industry. And being publicly funded, it allows us to share a lot of our inventions. You know, I came from commercial background, and I have to say I was shocked when I came into the BBC that we would develop new technologies and then we would just give them away free to everybody in the industry. And I've sort of got used to that. I'm not sure I'm completely there on that one, but I've got used to it because I understand that actually it helps the overall media industry when the BBC shares its technology with them. In terms of some other areas of innovation, one of the key areas that I've seen incredible innovation even in the few years that I've been at the BBC is around news and news gathering. So journalists and the whole news organisation rely absolutely on technology. And the goal of news is to get that content as quickly as possible, ideally video content. Doesn't really matter about the quality, but get it up on the news channel as quickly as possible, get it out there for the audience to see. And some of the interesting challenges that we've seen in news have been around how you get that technology out there and how you use that technology. As recently as the Falklands conflict, it took us 2 weeks to get video footage, or film footage as it was probably in those days, back to the UK and onto the news program. So imagine that. So footage, you imagine, you know, we see live pictures of war zones today. Even back in the 1980s, was it 80s? Yes, early 80s. It took us 2 weeks to get that video content back to the BBC. And one of the things the BBC pioneered was that submission of live video onto news. So we started out in actually late 90s, 1997, developing technology that used ISDN lines or telephone lines for submission of video. So originally it wasn't live video. You could record the video and then you could play it up and then they would re-record it on the other end. But eventually it became live video over ISDN lines. And this was a fascinating chapter in the BBC's news history because the first place we trialled this was in Munich, and then the second place was in Pakistan. So in 1997, we bought 3 ISDN lines in Pakistan, and we set up all our equipment and could return video feeds from the field to the news bulletin. And I don't know if we had inside knowledge. Maybe, you know, our friends over at MI6 gave us a tip-off or something. But the point is, there was a coup in Pakistan in 1997. And what the army did is not only did they take over the country, but they took over the television station, which had the only satellite uplink in the entire country. So no news organisation could cover the coup that was going on in Pakistan, except the BBC, because we had these 3 ISDN lines, and we were the only news organisation in the world who were able to take video content from that event. And so, you know, very fortuitous for us that we chose somewhere where a news story was going to happen. In fact, one of the things I often say is if a bunch of news reporters turn up from the BBC, that's the time to leave any place you're in, because something bad's probably about to happen. Of course, these days we think nothing about digital cameras recording content and then using you know, 3G connections, 4G connections to upload that content. But actually, if you think about it, even, you know, in 1999, the cost of having a device that could digitize video content was about £10,000 to £15,000. So we had very specialist cards that went into computers that would digitize the content. And the world has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years. We also have some fascinating news-gathering vehicles within the BBC, and we've developed some interesting things really in the last 2 or 3 years around how do you capture news very, very quickly. So in the old days, a big truck would turn up, a lot of men would get out of the truck, they would put a satellite dish up on the roof, they would run cables, they'd fire up a generator, and within about 8 or 9 hours, you were ready to do your broadcast from wherever you were. Today, we have these small vans designed by the BBC, built by a third party, but designed by the BBC. And they have a number of very, very clever technologies. So what happens is the van pulls up at the location, whatever it may be, a news story. And it's driven by the journalist, so there are no technicians on the van at all. The journalist presses a red button on the dash of the van, and immediately the satellite dish on the roof flips up, finds the satellite, connects it back to the BBC, and then it creates a Wi-Fi network around the van. It has a camera on top of the van which is remotely controlled back from head office. So within the BBC, literally within about 30 or 40 seconds of the van stopping, you can start zooming the camera, moving the camera around, capturing live footage from the scene. And then the journalist gets out of the van, picks up their radio mic, picks up their radio camera, and they're immediately connected back to the office. And this has been a fantastic innovation for us. And we first tried this out actually with the floods about 2 years ago. And the fascinating thing was that the journalist was still fiddling around trying to get his camera sorted out and his microphone sorted out, and we were already putting footage out on the BBC website of the live scene of those floods. So real change there in terms of the way in which we gather news content. The other thing we've done is journalists in the field have changed the way they work. So again, in the old days, an entire crew would have to go out. They would have to go and set up, equipment and cameras. Today we have a lot of self-op journalists who go out with their own camera. They have editing equipment on a laptop computer. They film their news bulletin. They put it on their computer and then they upload it. So, in fact, you'll have seen that just recently with the snow. Some of the journalists didn't make it into the office. They just filed their report from a field at the back of their house going, wow, look at all this snow, isn't it incredible? But it's changed some of the culture. So think about news bulletins now. Very often you get a news bulletin from inside of a hotel room because, they're in downtown Baghdad when there's bombing going on, or they're in Israel when there are rockets coming in, and they're sitting in a hotel room talking to you live on the news. Complete change. We used to have studios. We used to, everything was done much more formally than it is today. But also the technology that they use has to change because the culture has changed. So if you remember the London riots 18 months ago, one of the features of the London riots was that news crews got attacked. So they got bricks thrown at them and they were attacked. I was actually watching the news, and for my sins, all of the BBC technology vehicles come out of my budget as well. And when they torched the radio car in Salford, I was very, very disappointed because that was a big slice of my budget going up in flames. But the interesting thing is, think about big shoulder mount cameras. You really don't want to be in a riot in Tehran carrying a big shoulder mount camera, because if you don't get hit over the head with a brick, then one of the security guards is probably going to shoot you or at least arrest you. So big move away from large cameras to small discrete cameras, very often just using an iPhone or a small mobile device to film in dangerous situations. One of the interesting things is we thought, well, then we can get rid of these shoulder mount cameras. They're very expensive, quite difficult to maintain, and we can just go for these little handheld consumer cameras. But it turns out when you interview a VIP, particularly if they're an MP, and I apologize if there are any in the room, it's very important that you turn up with a very large shoulder mount camera. So some of the other challenges we have are that very often news crews are targeted because what they're reporting on isn't liked by the state they're in. So I'll share with you, for example, in Syria today, with the conflict that's going on, some of our crews who have been in with the rebels are actually targeted by government forces because they don't want the news to get out. And so what happens is two things. One is if you put a satellite dish up or something that they can see, then obviously you're making yourself a target. But secondly, they can use electronic targeting. So your transmission can be picked up and they can triangulate that. And we have had instances of buildings where journalists have been in, just blocks of flats and things, being targeted in war zones because the output isn't always what the local government would like the BBC to be reporting on. So we're having to get smarter about how we do bursts of information, and then you can move very, very quickly. The other thing is journalists often get embedded with military, and military move around a lot, so you can't, again, spend a lot of time doing your transmission. So we've had to develop ways in which that can be done in the background while journalists are moving on the back of a truck or something like that. I will say, speak out for the competition. Sky did an incredible thing in Libya when Tripoli, when the rebels moved into Tripoli. Sky managed to get a crew on the back of one of the rebel trucks, and they literally handheld a satellite uplink dish pointed roughly in the direction of the satellite while this truck was driving into into Tripoli. An incredible use of technology to get live footage back. The other area where we see a lot of innovation is obviously sports, and it was fascinating talking to people downstairs before this event, because if there's one thing the BBC's done in the last 12 months that we'd like to talk about, there are other things we don't want to talk about, but that we'd like to talk about is the Olympics. And technology innovation in sports is something that is really changing the way in which consumers and audiences consume that content. So the Olympics for us was, we had 4 years to prepare for it, but it was a real landmark for us. The first thing was, it was the biggest digital media event ever. So the biggest online event in the history of the internet. And I'm sure, the next Olympics will be the biggest one again. But for us, we did a number of innovative things. So we took 24 standard definition and 24 high definition feeds. We made them available on the web and on satellite and on cable. And so it allowed people to watch every event that was going on. We took every single event. 2,500 hours of sport content was broadcast by the BBC during the Olympics. And that was a huge technological challenge for us. Not only in, taking all of those feeds and editorializing them and then feeding them out, but also just in the sheer bandwidth that we had to have in our networks to do that. We had just moved BBC Sport up to Manchester, so we had to take all of that content, feed it up a network up to Manchester, allow them to do their work on top of it, and then feed it down. We also did some novel things. So we built a studio on top of a council tower block overlooking the Olympic site. And it was quite interesting because Al Jazeera had the building next to us, so they had this very, very expensive, very posh studio. The BBC had 2 sheds on top of a council tower block, held on with scaffolding. But actually, the output was fantastic, and you would never have known that those events were being filmed in a shed. We did have some interesting challenges, of course, so we had to cut a hole in the roof of the building in order to get all of our cables and everything through it. And some of the residents, so the building's been condemned apparently for a number of years, but some of the residents have refused to move out. And so some of the residents made our lives a little bit difficult while we were there. But actually, overall, I think it was a fabulous event. But in terms of other things we also did a lot of work online to make a very rich experience. And so what we had was a web page for every event, for every team, and for every athlete. Now, I know what you're doing. You're sitting there thinking that was license fee money that you spent on that, and you probably had tens of thousands of people working on that, and it really wasn't a good use of money. But actually, we did a very, very clever thing. We used a technology called semantic technology, and essentially what that means is making logical associations between things. And what we did is we took lots and lots of different data feeds from many different sources. The Olympic broadcasters gave us data feeds. Our own journalists wrote editorial. We took all of the medal information. And then we used technology to match it together. So nobody created those athletes' pages. Nobody created the team pages. They were created by the technology just looking and going, that's a story about Jessica Ennis, and there's an athlete page for Jessica Ennis, so I'm going to put that story on that page. And it was so successful that we're going to be doing more and more of that. So you would never have known looking at those web pages that they weren't created by a human being, a journalist sitting behind it. So very, very successful use of technology at the Olympics. Of course, we've set the bar now, so, come Wimbledon, people are going to expect to see every court live. Glastonbury, they want to see every stage live. So we have some interesting technologies, and I'll touch on a couple of them in terms of what we're doing at Wimbledon. So one of the things that you might be forgiven thinking is that innovation only happens with online and the web, and perhaps a little bit with television, with 3D and things like that. But actually, we're doing huge amounts of innovation in the radio space as well. So I mentioned Wimbledon. One of the things we did at Wimbledon this year was called Gruntometer. So does anyone know what that was? What we did is whatever you do in the BBC, somebody's not going to be quite happy with the output, right? So what we get is people writing into us and saying, the athlete's grunting, the tennis player's grunting is very off-putting and we don't want to hear that. And then other people go, oh, you don't have the sound of the court loud enough. I want to hear the racket hitting the ball. I want that ambience feel. So what we decided is, okay, we'll put it all out on the web and we'll let you control it. So we took different audio feeds from different microphones, some by the athletes, some by the umpire, and some in the crowd, and obviously the audio commentary. And then we put it on the web as separate feeds with a mixer that allowed the audience to mix their own. So you could set whichever one louder that you wanted to do. And we did it I wouldn't say as a joke, but it was done more as a sort of experiment. It turned out to be incredibly popular, and people have asked us to go and do that again. So a kind of intriguing bit of innovation that we've done. The other thing that we've done is obviously moved a lot of our radio onto computers. So, you know, when music plays out on the BBC these days, apart from occasionally on Radio 3 where they insist on having the original vinyl, or obviously if it's live, it comes from a computer. And so we have these huge libraries of all of the music on a computer. And when the presenter just presses a button, far away in some data center somewhere, that audio starts to play. Imagine iTunes, but on a much grander scale. And so we've seen convergence of technology in the radio space between computing technology and broadcast technology have really started to allow us to do things differently. And one of the big challenges I had when I joined the BBC was the BBC has something in the region of £600 million worth of technology assets. And I can tell you that my budget isn't big enough to keep refreshing all of those assets every year. So we have to look at how can we be very effective in terms of our spend in money, but keep the audience services and quality up. And so one of the things we did with radio is we came up with a really interesting idea, which we've piloted now and we're deploying, to change the way in which we do local radio. So the BBC has local radio all over the UK. Each local radio station has at least 2 studios, and inside of those studios you'll find a large amount of technology, mainly computers, but there are obviously microphones and headsets and control surfaces. But the problem with putting computers in a studio is that they make a noise, they hum, and they also give off heat. So then we have to have very specialized air conditioning that's quiet but can cool the room. And we have to have you know, power and resilience and all sorts of things around that studio to make it work. And so we took a radical approach. We said, well, what if we took all of that technology out of the studio, put it away in a data center somewhere, and just in the studio just had the headphones, the microphones, and then the control surface for the presenter to control what was going on, but none of that technology was in the room. And at first we thought, no, it won't work because there'll be a lag. When you touch the button, it won't immediately respond because it's 100 miles away and things like that. We did a lot of work, and we've managed to develop what we call a virtual radio studio. And it's been an incredible success. So not only can we now refresh these local radio studios for a fraction of the cost that it used to cost the BBC to build studios, but also we got a couple of interesting benefits from it. The first one is that you can now run any radio station from any location. So if a building burnt down or we wanted to run a radio station from the high street, we can do that very easily. As long as we've got the connectivity, you can control the radio station from anywhere. The other thing that happened, which was quite fascinating, was there is a time lag. So when you press that button, there's about 30 millisecond time lag before the signal gets to the device in the data center and tells it to do whatever it is you've pressed the button to do. But what we found was the presenters, even without realizing it, started to preempt that delay. And so literally within about an hour of using the new technology, they're completely comfortable and they're pressing that button 30 milliseconds faster than they would have done, or sooner than they would have done in using the old radio studios. So lots of innovation happening in the radio space. Another interesting project that our research people are looking at is how do you drive 3D audio through headphones? So those of you who kind of listen to your iPod, what you'll realize is actually all you have is 2-dimensional sound. It goes left and right, and that's all it does. Because the human ear actually does the shaping of the 3D sound and tells us whether it's above us, below us, behind us. And so the BBC's been doing some fascinating research work around how can you, with headphones, emulate that 3D sound. And actually what they did is 2 PhD students, and love them, they took the practical approach. They put microphones in their ears and recorded the sound within their ears, first of all, to work out what was happening. But the benefit is that we will develop technology that in the future will allow us to do 3D sound over headphones. So lots of innovation happening around radio. In terms of the infrastructure side, we obviously have a lot of infrastructure, big networks, buildings full of technology, and a lot of my role is also about delivering that technology, delivering in a cost-effective way, but also enhancing and developing the new technology or delivering the new technology that the BBC will use. And we've had some very exciting projects recently. So I mentioned Manchester earlier on. BBC has 3 buildings in Salford and Manchester right on the waterfront, beautiful buildings, and we've put in brand new technology there. We've also changed the way in which we do our production, so not only is it all digital, but we share the studios, so the BBC doesn't own the studios. And so we have to be able to go into a studio very quickly, connect up everything, produce the program, and then leave the studio. And so that's given us lots of challenges, but also some interesting developments in terms of how we develop our technology for producing content and programs. And then our new broadcasting house development in W1, where we brought together all of our news organizations, all of our radio, and also our television into one built-for-purpose media building, has been fantastic. And there you'll see some incredible stuff, fantastic use of robotic cameras, although we had some interesting challenges, teething problems with them in the early days where cameras were crashing into each other, but we've solved all of those problems. But again, the development of the technology that we've used within our new broadcasting house has really fundamentally changed the way the BBC works and produces content. But one thing that was fascinating for me was that we learned something, that technology isn't always the answer. So historically you had news people who did radio, news people who did television, and news people who did online. And we tried to create technology to help them cooperate. What we did in New Broadcasting House, however, was to sit them all together right next to each other. And they've actually just started cooperating all by themselves. So sometimes you don't need technology to solve the problems, but it can help. And then, of course, the big one that I'm working on now, rather sadly, is that we're exiting Television Centre. But the interesting thing is it only took us a year to get the people out of Television Centre. So by April of this year, there'll be no more BBC staff working in Television Centre. It's going to take nearly 3 years to get the technology out of Television Centre. So technology is becoming an increasing part of everything that we do. I want to touch on the archive for a minute. So the BBC has an incredible archive. It goes back 90 years, obviously, to the beginning of the BBC. And we have a state-of-the-art facility where we keep all of this content. And we have 60 miles of shelving within this facility on which we keep everything. And as a friend of mine rather glibly pointed out, he said that actually you don't have to lay the tapes out along the shelf as a one long piece of tape. You can actually stack them up in rolls. But what we have done is we've been working on how do we exploit the archive and how do we use the archive more in the future. And so our archive actually covers a number of things. We have a paper archive. And so within the paper archive, we also have 6 million photographs, but we have a priceless archive of, thank you letters from the King, application. I met Michael Palin just recently, and we dug out his original application letter to the BBC, and I said to him, do you remember this? He said, absolutely. He said there was 3 guineas riding on that letter, he said. But priceless paper within the archive. One of the fascinating things for me was we have the original planning documents and approval documents for Television Centre. And I was fascinated to read that we were going to build a helistrip on top of Television Centre because the view was that, within 20 years of building Television Centre, everyone would have a helicopter and we'd all be travelling around, flying everywhere. Of course, there's a serious side to the archive. More recently, unfortunately, it's had to be used to pull legal documents and information around some of the challenges that the BBC's been facing. But the thing I love about all of the archive is that we're holding this in posterity for future generations to mine and to enjoy. We also have an incredible audio archive, obviously going back to the beginning of radio, and we have some original wax cylinders from the very early days. We also have a lot of shellac discs. Again, the legend has it that the length of the BBC radio programs was limited by how much you could put on a disc. So, originally the discs would hold 15 minutes and then they went up to 30-minate discs, and so the programs extended out to 30 minutes. Again, I wasn't around, I don't know if that's true, but it sounds very plausible. And there are, again, lots of technology sort of innovations that have happened around that archive. I mean, clearly magnetic tape, and we've gone through many, many different generations of magnetic tape, both on video and on audio. Vinyl collection, so we have one of the world's largest vinyl collections. A lot of them pre-release, they were not pre-released now, but they were pre-released when we got them. So they're sort of like a first day cover of a book, if you like. But of course now more and more of that audio and video is digital within the archive. So actually the archive is also big, large boxes of humming equipment as well as physical copies of things. And on the video side, Like the audio, a lot of it is on magnetic tape, but we also have an extensive film archive, which we keep, in a vault. And one of the reasons we hold on to film is that, unlike digital videotape, where the quality is only the quality that you will ever get, you can't enhance the quality. With film, every few years somebody comes out with a clever algorithm about getting better quality out of film, digitizing film. So we'll probably keep the film forever. We probably won't keep the tape forever. We'll digitize it and then get rid of the tape. And then, of course, we have the physical archive, and as I said, we brought some pieces from the physical archive. Much of it now sits in Bradford, in the Media Museum in Bradford, so rather than gathering dust in a warehouse for the BBC, we've donated a lot of it to there. We've also given a lot of it to the British Library, who use it for both display purposes, but also they provide a service. If you want to go and listen to an old BBC programme, the British Library provide that service. But there are some big challenges with the archive. So, first of all, one of the things that's happening with digital, so in the old days you were limited by how much footage you could shoot by the film that you could carry or the film that you took on location. Today with digital, people can take a disk drive and they can shoot thousands of hours. So what we've seen is, we use the term shooting ratios, but the amount of hours shot for an hour of output has really gone up dramatically. So in the old days you would have 4, 5 hours for an hour, maybe 10 hours for an hour of output. Today we've got programs that are shooting 100, 150 hours of output. And that gives the archivists a problem, because first of all, how much of that 150 hours should you keep? Should you throw it all away, or should you keep it all? The second thing is, reviewing all of that content takes a very long time. So, the new technology is starting to give us some interesting headaches. And then, of course, digital storage becomes a big challenge for us. So we have huge tape robots and also large amounts of spinning disk. The interesting thing is that the BBC took a decision to collect metadata, to collect information about what we had in the archive about 20, 25 years ago, long before anybody knew what we were going to use that information for. And as luck would have it, as we start to think about putting more and more content on the web, more and more content on video download services or video on demand services, finding that content becomes a problem. Those of you who use iTunes, you go into iTunes and you're faced with 30,000 songs. How do I know which song I like? Well, the BBC has this incredible archive of data around all of our content that allows you to search. So if you want to know, is there a scene in a film where there's a dog, a tree, and a Cadillac, I can tell you that because we have that data around all of the content. And that's really helping us to start exploiting the archive. But we have some challenges with the archive. So first of all, we get a lot of deterioration of the content. So those of you who know film rots away because of the nitrates that we use. And not only does it make it incredibly flammable, but it gets this thing called vinegar syndrome. So we've had to wash all of our film to remove all the nitrates. Tape actually sits on a cellulose backbone, and that cellulose essentially just rots away, particularly if it ever gets damp. And so we're having to do a large amount of digitization just to preserve all of the content within the archive. And that gives us another problem. So with all of this videotape, we don't have the heads left to read this tape. So old Betamax tapes and other tape formats, the heads that read the tape are wearing away, and of course you can't buy them. We've been on eBay, we bought up all the ones on eBay. We even talked to IBM down in Hursley at their research centre to see whether they could build us heads to read this tape, because we've got more tape than we've got life left in the heads, and so we're having to be selective about which stuff we digitize. But the hope is that at some point in the future we'll find another way to read those tapes. So the goal is to digitize the archive for preservation, also digitize it to make it available. We send out something like 4,000 to 5,000 tapes a week, mainly to BBC production teams, but to other researchers and other people. And interesting enough, the web is starting to open up new opportunities for archive content. So in the US, New York Times didn't have a lot of video content. And so what they did a deal with MSNBC to take their old video content, not their current news content, but their old video content. And so when a story breaks on the New York Times, what they do is they link to old news stories on the same topic. And what they found is that people not only click through to it, so if there's a tsunami warning in Asia, they have footage of the 2004 tsunami. But people click through and they watch it, and then they watch the rest of the news bulletin. So they've suddenly found a new lease of life for all of this old content. And of course, we use a lot of old content, not just for repeats, but actually for, historical documentaries, but also for retrospectives and things like that. So has a lot of value for us. We also have a couple of other things in the archive that are quite fascinating. One of them is our pronunciation department. So we have these 4 linguists who are the BBC pronunciation department, and if you want to know how to pronounce a foreign leader's name or a type of animal, they will tell you how to do that, and they use a sort of phonetic tool to help journalists do that. And it's quite good, actually. When you get into an argument, you can puddle along to the linguistic department, and they'll tell you how something is pronounced. We also have a huge library of recorded sounds that we use for dubbing and dubbing purposes. But we have to be very, very careful, because we sometimes have instances where we use the sound. So the Archers is a classic one. If we use the wrong teacups in the kitchen of wherever somebody's having tea, we get thousands of calls and letters saying those are not the right teacups for that kitchen. And so the sound archivists have to be very, very good at their job. And then we did have one interesting one where we put some bird sound on a background of a drama, just to give it some ambience and bird sound. And we got a lot of twitchers calling in saying that was a lesser spotted something or other, and they're not normally found in that part of the UK. And could you tell us where you filmed this? So we had to fess up and say no, that was put in. The other thing we have is a fascinating team of biologists. So I talked about that metadata. I talked about the fact that we put all of this logging around our content. But the BBC doesn't just go, that was a tiger or that was a polar bear. We have biologists who look at it and go, well, that's an adolescent female Sumatran tiger, and it's this genus and species. I have it written here in Latin, but I'm not going to embarrass myself by reading it out. But the point is that this is fascinating, because a lot of naturalists find that very, very useful, because they know if it's a BBC content, they'll get the right name for the animal or plant or whatever it is. And also, it does stop us doing silly things. It stops us putting the wrong animal in the wrong sequence and things like that. So, in terms of technology in the BBC, I've talked a lot about the historical technology in the BBC, and I just want to check how I'm doing for time. I'm okay for time. Please warn me if I'm getting out of time. The new technology that we've been deploying comes with a lot of challenges as well. So it isn't a utopia where whatever technology we deploy solves all of the problems. But I mentioned earlier about the fact that our audiences are starting to do something that the BBC didn't tell them to do. So they're starting to use things like Facebook, and they're starting to go and watch YouTube, and they're starting to do things where the BBC isn't leading them. They're actually going off and doing things. And that's a dilemma for the BBC. For 85 years of our history, the audience came to us, and now we're actually having to go and meet the audience where they want to be. And so the dilemma is, do you continue to say we want a direct relationship with our audiences, which we do, of course, or do you say, well, we also need to put our content where the audience... So do you put BBC content on YouTube? For example, people will always put pirated content up on YouTube. Should we replace that with original content? Because it's going to be put up there anyway, so wouldn't it be better to have good quality content rather than poor quality content? But the interesting thing is, people are not watching any less television. So the viewing of television hasn't gone down. In fact, it's gone up slightly. On average, 16.1 hours of viewing of BBC television by people in the UK and per week. And so we don't actually know where the time's coming from. So people are definitely going online. They're using a lot of time in Facebook and what have you, but they're not taking it away from us. We are seeing a slight decline in radio listening, and we think there are 2 reasons for that. Obviously, the younger generation, if you look at youngsters today, we did some research just recently, youngsters don't listen to the radio. It's not something that they do, and we're not sure whether, one morning they wake up and they're 25-year-olds, they're 25, and they think, oh, I need to turn the radio on today. We suspect not, in fact, and the fear is that, we're breeding a generation who don't see the radio as important. The second thing is that in the car, which is the domain of one of the domains of radio, is that people are starting to be distracted by other things. So they have sat-navs, they have internet connectivity. And Ford, quite interestingly, came to see us because Ford see themselves as becoming an information company of the future, a technology information company of the future, because they're saying within a car they can provide you not only navigation, but they can provide you weather, entertainment, information, all through having a connected car. And so that makes us sort of sit up and think, well, what is the future of inform, educate, and entertain if people aren't going to be listening to the radio in the car so much and they're going to be using these other services? So should the BBC be pushing its content through different ways to our audience? So one of the other challenges, and you will all know about this one, is competition for spectrum. So clearly the mobile operators would love to take all of that digital terrestrial spectrum that we use for television. They're not that interested in our FM spectrum, but they are interested in our television spectrum, and use that for mobile data services. And you know, quite honestly, it's an insatiable appetite. You know, we all have at least one mobile data device. Some of us have multiple mobile data devices. So we're all driving that demand, and it's continually squeezing. Now, we're getting better and better and smarter about how we use radio spectrum, but the bottom line is there just isn't enough. It's a finite resource, and there's real pressure on the BBC to look at different ways. The challenge is we have to reach every home and every person in the UK, and there isn't a viable alternative today. So even by 2020, the government are predicting not every home will have broadband. And you know, if you look at other technologies, satellite, cable, they don't have the same reach necessarily. And one of the problems we have with satellite is actually the rights holders of the content get very upset because we can't limit it to the UK. It spills over into other countries. One of the interesting things is we moved BBC Parliament off a European satellite footprint across Europe to just a UK satellite. So Astra have one that has a mainly UK satellite. And we got lots of complaints from Poland, of all places, of people who had been watching BBC Parliament and weren't happy that we changed it. The other thing is, obviously, there's a myriad of platforms out there that people consume our content on. So, you know, some of the challenges we have as an organization is, which platforms should we be on? Should we be on every device? Should iPlayer be on every single device that comes out? And the answer is, of course, not. But how do we predict where we should be putting our content? And of course, audience expectations go up and up and up. I talked about the Olympics and the fact that the audience now says, fantastic, that's what we want going forward. But, you know, it doesn't matter what's going on. You know, an oil spill in Alaska, a flood in Cumbria, a royal wedding, a war zone. People want live footage, they want HD footage, and they want lots of it. So those expectations are increasing. And then some technologies we just don't know whether they're going to take off or not. 3D is the classic one. So we've invested, you know, in 3D. We've done some 3D output. People like it. People don't want to watch it for 24 hours a day. So we don't know whether this is a passing fad or something we should invest in. So we're very open-minded about 3D at the moment, but we're not making major investments in it as a platform going forward. And then, of course, there's this web thing that's just come and changed everybody's lives, and you know, is probably the biggest phenomena in the the history of technology innovation. And the question is, you know, how should the BBC play in the web space? So obviously we're incredibly successful both with our interactive content and iPlayer, but equally we're having challenges around, you know, do you make the content available outside of the UK? Because geo-limiting it seems rather strange in a world of a global internet. And so lots of dilemmas and lots of challenges for the BBC Trust and for the BBC to figure out. I'd like to touch on just a couple of challenges around digital content. So one challenge we had was we moved to HD and digital, and we had a talk show on the BBC. I'm not going to name who it was, but it was a talk show on the BBC. You may be able to work it out. It was on BBC One. It's not on BBC One anymore. But the presenter liked to have the lights low because he likes to have an ambience in the studio. Now, those of you who understand digital camera technology know that digital cameras really don't like low light, and what they start doing is they create a noisy picture. That was fine. We could deal with that, and we could sort of hide the noise on the camera. But it completely floored us on our output. So right down the other end of the chain, we take all of those TV images, we compress them down, and we squeeze them into a multiplex, and we send them across the airwaves, and your television unpacks them. Now, there's a finite amount of bandwidth, and we share that bandwidth with other BBC channels and with ITV and other people. And what was happening was, because this picture was noisy, it couldn't be compressed because there weren't big blocks of the same color, there were lots of little speckles. And so what was happening was, when this program was being aired, ITV1 was starting to go blocky and break up. And they were upset about that, so we had to change it. But the solution was to turn the lights up in the studio. It wasn't about the compression technology, it wasn't about the transmitters, it was about the lights in the studio. And the other interesting one for me was that the demands of the audience are going up, but the demands of the creative and producers and directors are going up. So BBC Breakfast moved up to Manchester. Brand new building, brand new technology, completely exciting, innovative new studios and approach to how we were going to do BBC Breakfast. But on the very first day, and I have to say my heart was in my mouth on the first day. I don't normally watch BBC Breakfast, but I watched every second of it that day. They decided to do a live broadcast from a field in Oxfordshire to tell us what the weather was. They then decided that because it was the anniversary of the Titanic, they'd have a reporter on the ship that was following the path of the Titanic, again doing a live insert. And although the program was coming from Manchester, they decided they'd also do a segment from London. And so the producers and directors just have this assumption that all the technology is just going to work, it's going to be fantastic, and John, you're going to sort it out and it'll be great on the day. And so not only is there pressure from the audience, but there's pressure internally in terms of wanting to create more and more of a fantastic experience. So what about the future, right? So looking forward, where is the world going? And I just want to spend the last couple of minutes just talking a bit about the future. So first of all, we know that online and interactive is growing very, very fast. But in fact, today, video on demand accounts for only 2% of our output. So iPlayer is only 2% of the viewer hours of the BBC. So the tipping point hasn't happened yet. And we keep predicting it. We predicted it in 2013. We're now predicting it might be 2016, 2017, where you get a sort of 50% of the content is viewed over IP or on demand versus live output. What we are seeing is time shifting happening. So around 10% of viewing now is time shifted, but the bulk of that is personal video recorders, so digital recorders at home. People record stuff, TiVo boxes and things like that. We're not necessarily seeing it. But we are seeing phenomenal growth, both iPlayer and iPlayer on mobile in particular, growing incredibly quickly. So we know that tipping point is going to come, but we don't know when it's going to come. The other thing from a technology point of view is there are new kids on the block. And these new kids on the block are broadcasters. And they're called Google, and they're called Amazon, and they're called Microsoft, and they're called Apple. And these companies are broadcasting over the internet, over the top of the internet, and they're doing it very, very successfully. YouTube and Netflix and Love Film and others are starting to become incredibly dominant in their markets. They have very deep pockets, they're global organizations, and the BBC has to figure out, how do we play alongside these people? Do we give them our content, or do we not give them our content? They want to get between us and our audience. We don't want that to happen. And so the landscape is changing. It's not Sky, it's not ITV, it's actually a new generation of technology-led broadcasters that are changing the world. Clearly, my job continues to be tough. I'm sure you probably think I've got a huge budget, but the bottom line is our budgets are going down in the BBC, and yet our services have to continue to be as great, as prolific as before. We've tried shutting down services in the BBC, and guess what? The audience really don't like that. And so we're having to get smarter and smarter about how you use technology to become much more cost-effective. But the good news is the BBC is at the top of its game. Our audience appreciation figures are higher than they've ever been. Our viewing hours are higher than they've ever been. The quality of our output is higher than it's ever been. So I actually feel really optimistic about the future of the BBC, and I think technology is going to continue to be an incredible enabler for the BBC. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the insight, and sorry there wasn't any scandal. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, after 3.5 years at the BBC, you seem to have compressed an amazing amount of knowledge into that lecture tonight, and thank you very much indeed for that. Now we've got the opportunity for 10 minutes of question time or so, and then dinner. So who's going to start us off? Yes, sir. Could you also give your name? It would be a good idea for the record.
Hi, I'm Clifford Goodman from the Foundation for Science and Technology. Fascinating talk.
Thank you.
When you talked about moving the studios to the cloud, is there a security issue about not stopping someone taking over the feed to the broadcasting network?
Yes. So, look, you know, I could talk for hours on this topic. As soon as you start using infrastructure that isn't under your direct control, then there is a level of risk. The way in which we do that, though, is that this infrastructure is actually under our control, so it's a private cloud that sits on BBC infrastructure. Having said that, more and more we're looking at using you know, the internet for data transmission and looking at using public cloud. We take a decision around two things. One is around security, stopping people sort of interfering with our output. And of course, in a digital world, it's technically easier. So in the old days, if I brought you a tape, handed you a tape and said, put that in the play-out machine and play it, I know that nobody's interfered with that tape in the time it left my hands and got to your hand. In a digital world, if it's a file that's traversed the internet, somebody may have interfered with that, you know, and there are lots of people out there who would quite like to interfere with that. So you imagine, you know, a BBC program playing out in the middle of it, somebody gets their message into it. So we use a lot of technology, and I'm not going to talk about everything that we use, but we use a lot of technology to ensure integrity of the file that's moved across, and also a lot of technology to look at how we defend ourselves from cyber attack and from people interfering with our services. And at the end of the day, we also have a big red lever that we can pull, where we can actually pull back and stop you know, a broadcast happening, obviously, if the worst happened. But it is a real serious point. And one of the things I will say is that when I was at Microsoft and when I was at Yahoo, the kind of people who attack their infrastructure tend to be either ego or technologically driven. The kind of people who want to interfere with the BBC tend to be ideologically driven, and some of them have quite serious backing behind them.
Tony?
I'm Teddy Ridley. The BBC is one of the great organisations in my life, but I hear and you hear that it is hamstrung by multiple levels of inefficiency. Good engineering is efficient engineering. Is there an incompatibility?
So look, the BBC, one of the reasons I was hired into the BBC was that the BBC has recognised that it has to become a much more agile, flexible, nimble organisation, and I think it is becoming that. And you know, I never thought I would say those words, but I honestly believe that. Look, the BBC has removed huge amounts of cost. I mean, we took 20% of our costs out last year. And so it is becoming less and less inefficient. Can you say that? Double negative. But the point is, it's becoming much more efficient. Technology helps us to do that. And we use, you know, good engineering. Look, we don't always get it right. You know, sometimes the technology causes the problem. And I think, you know, sometimes it's easier to change people than it is to change technology, ironically. But we're getting better and better at it. In terms of, you know, the BBC's efficiency, I would say that the BBC is you know, on a journey to become, you know, one of the most efficient broadcasters in the world. And certainly, you know, some of the innovations that we've put in place in terms of how we do content production, how we do content delivery, have really significantly reduced the cost and the time taken to do that.
Alex.
Alec Rose. What is the business model for radio now? Because, you know, having been somebody who's very old now and travel with shortwave radios, and I always try to encourage the BBC to get money off Sony because they sold all these radios only to listen to the BBC. We don't carry shortwave radios anymore because local radio is carrying it, particularly in the States, in Australia, all over the world. Is that a good business? You charge them enough? Or is that a growing business? Or what is the business model emerging into as that's happening?
Well, so look, first of all, in terms of the publicly funded BBC, our business is to get viewers and listeners, so it's about audience reach. In terms of our commercial organisations, so BBC Worldwide, they then sell on BBC services typically outside of the UK, but obviously they sell CDs and downloads in the UK. In terms of radio, I mean, the future of radio is fascinating. So we've seen the internet, and internet radio is a global phenomenon, and you're absolutely right. You can listen to BBC radio around the world, which is fantastic. I think it's a great thing to do. There probably isn't a huge amount of money in it. You know, people aren't going to pay a lot of money to get BBC radio in countries around the world, but there obviously is some money in it. But look, nobody's really making money out of radio. The commercial radio stations are struggling at the moment. And so, you know, radio is something that is in the hearts of, you know, the British people. We love our radio. We like to, and it fills quite a unique place in that you can do things while you can cook while you're listening to the radio. You can read a book while you're listening to it. You can do lots of things. Whereas, you know, television is a much more immersive experience, and clearly browsing the web is a completely immersive experience. So I don't think radio is going away anytime soon. We're looking at new technologies. We're obviously looking at, you know, what becomes, you know, what comes after DAB, you know, DAB Plus and other things. But also we're looking at ways in which audio distribution may not be called radio in the future, could be used. And, you know, the point I made about the Ford car is interesting because, you know, could it be that the BBC delivers Ford, you know, digital audio streams that they then play out in their cars? So I think there are lots of interesting opportunities for radio going forward, and it's certainly not going away anytime soon. I mean, the interesting thing with long-wave radio is the BBC, again, has tried to turn it off on several occasions, and we get a lot of pushback on that. And clearly, the BBC World Service continues to be dominated by radio and listened to by, you know, tens of millions of people around the world who love that connection back, you know, to the UK, or see the BBC as an honest broker in terms of their news. So we're not seeing, you know, that radio is going to disappear anytime soon. But, you know, can you make lots of money out of radio? Probably not at the moment, I wouldn't have thought.
Alex. Hi, Alex Dorian. The BBC had to come to Microsoft to get you in terms of changing the way they accept technology. The Academy is very focused on skills in the UK. Do you find it difficult to attract the right sort of people with the right sort of technology skills into the BBC?
Yes, and in fact, that was how Sir John and I met. So the BBC is investing a lot of money in development of technology skills. And look, if you're 21 and you're graduating from university with an electronics engineering degree, you don't want to go and work in radio today. It's probably not the first thing you think about. What you want to do is you want to go and build Facebook and retire at 23. And so we have a real problem because we have an aging workforce of incredibly talented engineers, but they're all in their mid to late 50s now, and, you know, they've got, you know, good pensions and they're thinking about retiring. And so one of the things we're doing is we're setting up an apprenticeship scheme. So starts this September, where we're going to start bringing in apprentices into the BBC, and we're working with universities so that essentially at the end of your apprenticeship you get a master, an accredited master's degree from a university, as well as having had 5 years of great training with the BBC and other organisations. But it is a challenge because getting people who, you know, even when they do join the BBC, technologists go, well, I want to work on iPlayer, you know, that's the really sexy. I don't want to do, you know, studios and what have you. And so a lot of my job is actually going out and speaking at events about all of the cool things that we do. And, you know, you talk about virtualization of local radio, and you can see people's eyes light up, these young kids. They go, oh, so it is quite cool, it is fun. And so part of it is about investing in you know, the next generation coming in. Part of it is about, you know, telling people about the fantastic stuff that we do in the BBC and helping them understand that it's a great place to work. But it's a real challenge. You know, in 10 years' time, I don't think the BBC could put on the Olympics in the way that we just have unless we do something about the talent that's coming through.
What's the most exciting thing about your job when you get up in the morning?
Wow. Well, look, you know, I don't know.
Or what do you fear most, perhaps, when you get up?
What I fear, that's a longer question. I don't know if Tony Hall is in the room, so I need to be careful. But, look, I have the world's biggest toy box. I mean, it is fantastic in terms of the fantastic technology that we work with and the fact that we touch millions of users, millions of audience every day. So that's really exciting, and that gets me, you know, out of bed in the morning. What am I afraid of? I'm afraid of the cyber threat to the BBC. I think that's a genuine risk for the organisation. I think it's a genuine risk for the country. I'm afraid of the talent challenges that we have. And I'm also, I'm terrified that we go off air. Stuff breaks all the time, and you do your homework and you build a resilience. But if BBC One goes off air, there are questions in Parliament. I'm terrified of that.
Yeah. Well, I think that might be a good note to end on. I wonder, did Lord Hall arrive? No, he hasn't, I think. The new Director General designate hasn't arrived. At least he hasn't come here. He may turn up for his dinner, though. I'm sure you'd all want me to say a huge thank you to John for a stimulating lecture. It's been tremendous to get behind the scenes and hear what's going on. And we want to say a huge thank you for taking the time. It must have taken a lot of time to put all of that together. And I can assure you that this particular audience has truly appreciated it.
Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed.